April 17, 1945. A frozen rail yard outside Munich. A German nurse was chained to a steel bar inside a cattle car by her own countrymen and left to die. Her crime was not treason. It was not espionage. Her only crime was telling fellow Germans they should surrender. For that, she was shackled with iron cuffs and abandoned in the cold. 5 days without food. 5 days without water. The chain connecting her wrist to the bar was too short to let her stand and too short to let her sit. She hung somewhere between legs trembling, waiting for death or something worse, the Americans. Because the propaganda had taught her that Americans were monsters in uniform, animals who tortured prisoners and showed no mercy. But when the rusted door of that cattle car was finally torn open and morning light flooded into the darkness, the American soldier standing before her did not ask who she was. He did not demand the location of her commanders. He did not raise his weapon. He set his rifle down against the door frame, stepped inside slowly and crouched to her eye level. Then he asked one question. Just one. And that question did not hurt her. It did not threaten her, but it shattered every wall that 12 years of propaganda had built inside her mind. And what makes this story truly extraordinary is not that question. It is the secret the American soldier was carrying. A secret folded into a letter hidden at the bottom of his pack. A secret that connected him to her family in a way neither of them could have imagined. A secret that if she ever discovered, it would make forgiveness the hardest choice of her life. To understand how these two people ended up connected by that secret, we need to go back to the beginning. To a frozen morning in Bavaria when a sergeant from Alabama led 12 exhausted men down a set of railroad tracks and almost walked past the one door that would change everything. The rail yard had no name anymore. Whatever bureaucratic designation the Germans had stamped on their schedules and freight manifests was gone, now erased by the same artillery that had cratered the switching station and bent the signal towers into shapes no engineer would recognize. By mid-April of 1945, it was just another wound in the Bavarian landscape, another scar left behind as the Third Reich bled out across southern Germany. Sergeant Thomas Harlan's patrol reached the yard at 6:30 in the morning. 12 men, tired, cold, their boots crunching on frost that still clung to the gravel despite the weak morning sun. They had been walking since before dawn, following rail lines eastward, part of the massive cleanup operation that trailed behind General Patton's Third Army like a broom sweeping up the debris of conquest. The 4th Infantry Division had pushed through some of the worst fighting the Western Front had ever seen. The Hurtgen Forest, the Ardennes, the Rhine crossing. Now the fighting had moved on, and what remained was the sorting, cataloging what the retreating Wehrmacht had abandoned in their haste to escape the closing American pincers. Standard procedure: check every building, every boxcar, every cellar. Look for hidden weapons, intelligence documents, stragglers who had not gotten the message that the war was over for them. Harlan was 28 years old but looked older. 3 years of war had carved lines into his face that should have taken another 2 decades to form. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his features weathered in the way of men who had grown up working cattle under the Alabama sun. His father ran a ranch outside Tuscaloosa. Harlan had planned to take it over someday. That was before the war, before everything. He gave the order in that soft Alabama drawl that carried farther than it should have. Spread out, 2 men per car, check everything, anything unusual you call out. As he spoke, he looked down at his hands. His right hand trembled slightly against the stock of his rifle, not from cold. He closed his fist, squeezed hard, then released. A habit he had developed recently. 2 weeks ago, when his unit captured a group of surrendering German soldiers near a burned-out village, Harlan had seen something on one of them. A unit patch. The same division that had fought at the Hurtgen Forest. The same division responsible for the fighting that killed his younger brother Billy in November of 1944. Billy Harlan, 22 years old, dead in a frozen foxhole with a letter to his brother still in his pocket. When Harlan saw that patch, something broke inside him. He grabbed the German soldier, a boy really no older than Billy had been, and hit him, and kept hitting. He did not stop until Corporal Luis Estrada pulled him off, both arms wrapped around Harlan's chest, dragging him backward, while the German lay on the ground, bloodied and terrified. The soldier survived. But Harlan's hands had not stopped trembling since. Nobody in the squad knew about this except Estrada. and Estrada had sworn he would never speak of it again. He walked 2 paces behind the sergeant now. 22 years old, born in El Paso, Texas, the son of a blacksmith. His hands were calloused from years of working metal. He was the only person Harlan trusted completely, and the only person who had seen the sergeant at his worst. Behind them both walked Private Walter Finch, 20 years old, Dallas-born, still uncomfortable in a helmet that looked borrowed from an older brother, still flinching at loud noises, still innocent in a way that Harlan envied and resented in equal measure. Cars 1 through 6 yielded nothing remarkable. Empty, abandoned. Some had their doors hanging open like slack jaws. Others contained mundane cargo. Crates of ammunition with no guns to fire them. Medical bandages that would never wrap wounds. Stacks of Wehrmacht uniforms still sealed in paper, waiting for soldiers who would never wear them. The statistics of collapse surrounded them. In the final months of the war, the German rail network had moved over 400,000 troops and countless tons of material in desperate futile attempts to reinforce crumbling fronts. Now those same rails carried nothing. Locomotives sat cold and dead. Freight cars stood open to the rain. But what those rails had carried in their final days was something no military report had prepared these 12 men to find. If stories like this matter to you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. And stay with me until the very end, because what these men are about to discover will begin a chain of events that spans 60 years and 2 continents. Then they reached the 7th car. Private First Class Estrada tried the door and found it locked. Not just closed, chained. Heavy links wrapped around the exterior handles, secured with a padlock that gleamed dully in the gray morning light. Sergeant Estrada called out, "Got something here." Harlan walked over. He examined the chain, ran a finger along the cold metal, his brow furrowed. The question formed in his mind before he spoke it aloud. Why would someone chain a cargo car from the outside? Estrada shrugged. Keep something in, maybe. Or keep us out. Harlan stood there for a long moment, studying the sealed door. In 3 years of war, he had learned to read situations the way his father had taught him to read weather back in Alabama. The way clouds gathered before a storm. The way stillness in the air meant something was coming. This felt wrong. The Wehrmacht abandoned equipment constantly now. They left tanks, artillery pieces, entire motor pools behind without a second thought. But they did not lock things up and throw away the key. Not unless they were hiding something or leaving something to die. "Cut it," Harlan said quietly. Estrada pulled bolt cutters from his pack. The chain snapped with a metallic crack that echoed across the empty yard, sharp as a rifle shot. Birds scattered from a nearby roofline, their wings beating against the silence. Harlan gripped the door handle. The metal was ice cold, burning his palm, even through his gloves. He pulled. The door slid open with a grinding screech of rusted wheels, and morning light flooded into the darkness within. The smell hit them first. Not death, thank God. Not the sweet, rotting smell they had learned to recognize in liberated camps and bombed-out buildings, but something almost as terrible. Unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness, and fear so thick and old it had taken on a physical quality, like a fog that clung to the wooden walls and the frost-covered ceiling. Then Harlan's eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he saw them. Shapes, human shapes. Women huddled against the wooden walls of the cattle car, wrapped in torn blankets, staring at him with eyes that expected the worst. He counted quickly, 23 women. Most wore torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, the gray-green of nurses, clerks, radio operators. Some had blankets pulled around their shoulders. Others sat in the dirty straw that covered the floor, staring at nothing. In one corner sat a single bucket. That was their toilet for 5 days. The smell came from there. But Harlan's eyes kept returning to the woman in the center of the car. She was young, mid-20s. Her nurse's uniform was filthy, torn at the shoulder, stained with blood that might have been hers or someone else's. Dark blonde hair hung in matted strands around a face streaked with dirt. Metal shackles bound both wrists. A short chain connected them to the vertical support bar that ran from floor to ceiling in the middle of the car. The chain was too short for her to stand up fully and too short for her to sit down completely. She was trapped in a half-crouched, legs trembling from exhaustion, muscles that had been locked in that position for days, screaming for relief they could not find. When the door opened and light poured in, the women reacted differently. Some covered their faces as though expecting to be struck. Others just stared too exhausted to care. A few whispered to each other in German voices, barely audible. But the chained woman looked up at Harlan directly. Her eyes were dark sunken from days without sleep or food, but they were not empty. Fear lived there, yes, but something else too. A kind of stubborn defiance that came from having already prepared for the worst. She had been told what Americans did to prisoners, especially women. Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda ministry had been broadcasting warnings 24 hours a day in those final months. Americans would torture captured Germans, rape the women, leave them to die in roadside ditches. Better to swallow cyanide than surrender to the Allies. Every German had heard these warnings, seen the posters, listened to the radio broadcasts. This woman had believed them. Now here she was chained like an animal, and the enemy had found her. She braced herself for what came next. Harlan stood in the doorway. Behind him, Estrada and the others waited watching. The sergeant looked at the chained woman for a long moment. She looked back, waiting. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her whole body was tensed, every muscle rigid, ready for pain. Then Harlan looked down at his own hands, still trembling. He saw them for what they were. Hands that had shown cruelty 2 weeks ago. Hands that had beaten a surrendering man. Hands that could so easily become the very thing he was supposed to be fighting against. He stood at the edge of a choice that would define the rest of his life. He lowered his rifle, set it carefully against the doorframe, stepped inside the car, slowly, carefully, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt if you move too fast. He stopped a few feet from her, crouched down to her eye level so she would not have to look up at a man towering over her. And in simple, clear English, knowing she probably would not understand all the words, but hoping his tone would carry the meaning, he asked one question. "When did you last eat?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Not who are you, not why are you chained, not where are your commanders, just concern for the most basic human need. When did you last eat? The woman's name was Annalise Brandt, though Harlan did not know that yet. She stared at him, her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had been preparing herself for cruelty, for hatred, for violence. She had built walls inside her mind, thick and high walls designed to withstand whatever the Americans would do to her. 12 years of propaganda had taught her exactly what to expect. But this question, this simple human question, it bypassed every defense she had constructed. Tears began streaming down her dirty face. Her shoulders shook. She tried to speak, tried to answer, but all that came out was a sum, then another, then she was crying openly, uncontrollably. All the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past 5 days pouring out in broken sobs that filled the cattle car and echoed off the wooden walls. Harlan did not move. He stayed right there, crouched in front of her, waiting. His face calm, patient, not threatening. Behind him, Estrada shifted uncomfortably. Finch swallowed hard. This was not what any of them had expected to find today. The other women in the car watched in silence. Some began crying too, not from fear anymore, from something else entirely. Confusion, disbelief. This was not the enemy they had been promised. This was not the monster the propaganda had described. But one woman in the far corner did not cry. She watched Harlan with eyes that were neither afraid nor grateful. She was 19 years old, thin and sharp-featured, with the careful posture of someone always calculating. Her name was Sigrid Wendt, and she had served as a signals operator for the Wehrmacht. While the other women wept with relief, Sigrid observed. She noted the position of Harlan's rifle against the doorframe. She counted the soldiers visible outside. She measured the distance to the tree line beyond the rail yard. This was not the reaction of a frightened prisoner. This was the reaction of someone still fighting a war that everyone else knew was already lost. After several long minutes, Annalise's crying subsided. She was still trembling, but she had regained some control. She looked at Harlan through tear-blurred eyes. He was still there, still waiting, still looking at her like she was a person, not an enemy. Harlan stood up slowly, turned to his men. Estrada, get the bolt cutters. And someone radio back to command. Tell them we need medical personnel out here. Multiple civilian prisoners, at least one in bad shape. He looked back at Annalise. We are going to get you out of those chains. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time in 5 days, something other than fear entered her heart. Hope. Estrada moved forward with the bolt cutters. Annalise flinched when he approached. Her body went rigid. Harlan held up his hand in a calming gesture. "It is okay," he said softly. "We are going to help you." The blacksmith's son from El Paso positioned the bolt cutters around the chain connecting her shackles to the metal bar. He was careful not to touch her wrists. He knew metal. He knew how to cut without causing harm. One squeeze. The chain snapped. Suddenly, Annalise could move. After 5 days locked in that half-crouch, she could finally shift her weight. Her legs gave out immediately. She collapsed to the floor of the cattle car, unable to stand. The shackles were still on her wrists, connected by a short length of chain, but at least she was no longer bound to the bar. Harlan pulled a canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and held it out to her. "Water," he said, gesturing to his mouth. "Drink." She stared at the canteen as though it were something sacred. Her hand, shaking badly, reached out and took it. The metal was warm from being pressed against his body all morning. She brought it to her lips. The water was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank carefully, not frantically. Her body knew better than to drink too fast after days without water. Each swallow felt like life returning. Within the hour, medical personnel arrived. Captain Dorothy Pemberton stepped out of a jeep with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen too many casualties across too many field hospitals in France and Germany. 36 years old, Richmond, Virginia. No nonsense in every sense of the word. But even she paused when she saw the state of these prisoners. She assessed the situation in seconds and began issuing orders. Pemberton crouched beside Annalise, much as Harlan had done. She noticed the shackles immediately. The metal cuffs had cut deep into Annalise's wrists. The skin was bleeding in places, infected in others. 5 days of those iron cuffs grinding against bone and flesh, with no relief, had left wounds that would leave permanent scars. Pemberton cleaned the wounds as gently as possible while Annalise winced at every touch. "Who does this to their own people?" Pemberton muttered to no one in particular. Estrada spent 15 careful minutes cutting through the shackles without hurting Annalise further. When the metal finally fell away, she stared at her freed wrists. She rubbed them gently, feeling the absence of weight for the first time in days. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, but she made no sound. The other women were helped out one by one. Gertrude Lehman, 44 years old and the oldest among them, needed 2 soldiers to support her down from the car. She was a mother of 4 sons, all conscripted into the Wehrmacht, all missing. She kept whispering the same phrase over and over. "Sie helfen uns. Sie helfen uns wirklich." They are helping us. They are actually helping us. Young Sigrid Wendt was the last to accept help. She studied the soldiers' hands before taking them as though checking for hidden weapons. By noon, the Army field kitchen arrived. Hot soup, bread, canned vegetables. Nothing fancy, but it was hot and plentiful. The German women were gathered in a cleared area near the rail yard, sitting on blankets soldiers had laid out for them. They watched with wide eyes as metal cups of soup were distributed. The smell of food was overwhelming. According to military records, the average German civilian ration by April of 1945 had dropped to barely 1,000 calories per day. Many were getting far less. These women had eaten nothing at all in 5 days. Harlan brought a cup of soup to Annalise personally. She was sitting apart from the others, still looking dazed, her bandaged wrists held carefully in her lap. When he held out the cup, she did not take it at first. She just stared at the soup, then at him. Where was the trick? What did he want in return? Every interaction with authority she had known for years had come with a price. Nothing was given freely. There was always a cost. "It is okay," Harlan said gently. "Just soup. You need to eat." Finally, she took the cup with both hands. It was warm, the first warm thing she had held in days. She lifted it to her lips and sipped. The soup was thin, mostly broth with some vegetables and small pieces of meat. Nothing special, but to a woman who had been starving for 5 days, it was the finest meal ever prepared. She drank slowly at first, then faster, then forced herself to slow down again, as her shrunken stomach rebelled against the sudden nourishment. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Some cried as they ate. Others laughed in short, desperate bursts that came from relief and disbelief rather than joy. Gertrude Lehman kept repeating her phrase between spoonfuls. "They are feeding us. They are actually feeding us." Everything they had been told was a lie. The Americans were not animals. They were just men. Men who gave water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. And that truth was harder to accept than any cruelty would have been. 3 days later came the news that changed everything. A colonel from divisional headquarters arrived at the temporary camp where the women were being held. Through a translator, he explained the situation in clear, measured terms. The American military was managing over 400,000 German prisoners of war across camps in the United States. Texas alone held more than 70 such camps. The medical infrastructure at these camps was overwhelmed. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners needed care, and many refused to cooperate with American doctors who did not speak their language. The Army needed German-speaking medical personnel desperately. The offer was simple. Women with medical or administrative training could volunteer to work at a prisoner of war camp in Texas. Conditions would be good. Food, housing, medical care, a small salary. When the situation in Germany stabilized and the repatriation process was complete, they would be sent home. The women were divided. Some wanted to go home immediately, no matter how devastated Germany was. Others were terrified at the thought of traveling to the enemy's homeland. Gertrude Lehmann sat in silence for a long time. She wanted to stay in Europe and search for her sons. But the Red Cross officer told her plainly that the search could take years and that there was no infrastructure left in Germany to support it. If she went to America, she would have access to international mail systems, Red Cross databases, and military records that might help her find her boys faster than wandering through the rubble alone. It was Anneliese who finally convinced her. "Come with us," she said quietly. "You cannot search for your sons if you are dead from hunger." Gertrude closed her eyes, nodded once, raised her hand. Anneliese Brandt, sitting quietly in the back of the room, was doing something she had not done in years. She was thinking clearly. She had received a letter from her mother through the Red Cross just that morning. The words were written in shaky handwriting on a scrap of paper. Her father, Conrad Brandt the baker, was dead. Killed when the fighting swept through their town and destroyed his shop and half the street with it. Her younger brother, Gustav, conscripted at 16, was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Probably dead. Her mother, Matilda, was alive but barely living in the basement of a collapsed building in a neighboring village, sharing scraps with 5 other families, eating grass and tree bark to survive. Anneliese understood the mathematics of her situation with painful clarity. She could not help her mother by returning to Germany with empty hands. But if she went to America, she would have income. She would have connections. She would have the recommendation of Captain Pemberton. When she eventually returned, she could bring something real. Not just her presence, but the means to actually rebuild. This was not an emotional decision. It was the most rational choice she had ever made. She raised her hand. "I will go," she said in careful English. From across the room, Sigrid Wendt also raised her hand. Her face revealed nothing, but her eyes moved quickly, taking in the reactions of the other women, the posture of the American officers, the layout of the room. Whatever reasons Sigrid had for volunteering, it was not the same as Anneliese's. What Anneliese did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that Sergeant Thomas Harlan had also received new orders that same week. The 4th Infantry Division was being drawn down. Harlan, with his experience managing prisoners and his service record, was being transferred to Camp Mesquite, Texas, to serve as a security sergeant at the very same prisoner of war camp where Anneliese was headed. And deep in the bottom of his pack, beneath spare socks in a tin of boot polish, lay a letter. The last letter his brother Billy had ever written, sent from a frozen foxhole in the Hurtgen forest just days before a German bullet ended his life at 22. Harlan had read that letter 100 times. He knew every word by heart, including the final paragraph where Billy describes shelling a small German town and finding a bakery in the rubble afterward. A bakery in a small town in the Rhineland near the western edge of Germany. Anneliese Brandt had grown up in a small town outside Düren, not far from the Hurtgen forest. Her father, Conrad, had run a bakery there for 30 years, kneading dough every morning at 4 a.m., leaving white handprints on his daughter's dress when he lifted her up. That letter would take 6 months to surface, and when it did, it would shatter everything. But for now, on this cold April morning, Anneliese Brandt climbed aboard a military transport heading west, toward the coast, toward a ship, toward a country she had been taught to hate. She did not look back at the rail yard where she had been chained. She looked forward towards something she barely recognized anymore. Hope. And somewhere behind her, in another vehicle in the same convoy, Thomas Harlan sat with his pack between his boots and his brother's letter pressed against his chest, carrying a truth he did not yet fully understand. A truth that would eventually force both of them to answer the hardest question either would ever face. Not when did you last eat, but can you forgive the unforgivable? The first thing Annalise noticed about Texas was the sky. Not the heat, though the heat was extraordinary, pressing against her skin like a warm hand the moment she stepped off the transport truck. Not the dust, though it coated everything in a fine brown layer that turned her teeth gritty within minutes. It was the sky, vast and blue and stretching so far in every direction that she felt dizzy looking at it. In Germany, the sky had always felt close, hemmed in by mountains, church steeples, rooftops crowded together along narrow streets. Here there was nothing between her and the horizon, just flat land rolling outward forever, broken only by scraggly mesquite trees and wooden fence posts, and the occasional silhouette of cattle standing motionless in the shimmer of afternoon heat. She had crossed an ocean to get here. 5 days on a military transport ship crammed below decks with other prisoners and displaced persons, the constant roll of the Atlantic making half of them sick. Then a train from the East Coast rattling through cities and farmland and small towns where American flags hung from porches, and children waved at the passing cars without knowing or caring who was inside. Then finally the truck bouncing along a dirt road somewhere in central Texas carrying Annalise and 11 other German women toward a place called Camp Mesquite. The camp appeared on the horizon like a small city dropped into the middle of nowhere. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat grids behind perimeter fencing topped with barbed wire. Guard towers at each corner, and American flags snapping in the hot wind above the main gate. But inside those fences, the scene was not what Annalise expected. There were gardens, rows of vegetables tended by men in faded uniforms, a makeshift soccer field where prisoners kicked a ball back and forth in the dust, a small chapel with a wooden cross nailed above the door. Somewhere, someone was playing an accordion. According to military records, Camp Mesquite held approximately 3,000 German prisoners of war. Most were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS. Many had been captured in North Africa or France early in the war and had spent years in American custody. They had built routines, planted gardens, organized orchestras and theater groups and language classes. Some had learned English well enough to read American newspapers. The Geneva Convention was followed strictly. Prisoners received adequate food medical care and were paid 80 cents per day for labor. It was by any measure of wartime captivity remarkably humane. Several prisoners had written letters home telling their families they were being treated better in Texas than they had been treated in the German army. The truck stopped at the main gate. The women climbed down slowly, blinking in the harsh sunlight, pulling their thin clothes tighter around them, even though the air was warm. They looked like what they were: survivors of something terrible delivered into something uncertain. A man was waiting for them at the gate. Major Vernon Stokes stood with his back straight as a rifle barrel and his hands clasped behind him. 45 years old, lean and angular, with a narrow face and gray eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His uniform was pressed to perfection, not a single crease out of place, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dust that covered everything else within 100 yards. He was a man who imposed order on chaos by sheer force of will, and the camp around him reflected that discipline in every swept walkway and whitewashed wall and perfectly aligned row of barracks. He had served in the First World War. He knew what trenches smelled like, what mustard gas did to lungs, what it felt like to watch friends die in mud. That war was supposed to be the last one, the war to end all wars. And yet here he stood a quarter century later, running a prison camp in the middle of Texas for soldiers from the same country he had fought before. History repeating itself with a cruelty that felt almost personal. But the real weight Stokes carried was not from the First War. It was from a telegram that arrived in December of 1944. His son, Second Lieutenant Daniel Stokes, 22 years old, killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge. The details were sparse, the way military notifications always were. Enemy fire. Died of wounds. Buried at the American Cemetery in Henri-Chapelle, Belgium. A life reduced to 3 lines on a government form. Vernon Stokes received that telegram while standing in his office at Camp Mesquite, surrounded by 3,000 German prisoners. 3,000 men from the same nation that had just killed his only child. He did not break anything. He did not shout. He did not weep where anyone could see him. He folded the telegram, placed it in his desk drawer, and went back to work. But something shifted behind those gray eyes that day. Something closed. He continued to run the camp by the book. No prisoner was beaten. No ration was withheld. No regulation was violated. But the thin thread of human recognition that makes it possible to look at another person and see a fellow soul rather than an abstraction, that thread went quiet in Vernon Stokes on the day his son died. He looked at the prisoners and saw only the enemy, not individuals, not fathers or sons or husbands, just the enemy. And he managed them accordingly with the cold efficiency of a man filing paperwork on objects rather than people. Stokes watched the women climb down from the trucks. His eyes moved across them, quickly cataloging. When his gaze reached Annalise, it paused. He noted the bandages on her wrists, the way she held her head up, despite everything. The defiance in her posture that reminded him uncomfortably of his own stubbornness. Sergeant Harlan, report. Harlan had arrived at Camp Mesquite 2 days earlier. He stood at attention now, describing the situation at the rail yard. 23 women found in a locked cattle car, 1 chained, all malnourished, medical treatment provided. 12 volunteered for transfer to the United States to serve as medical and administrative support. Stokes listened without expression. Then he gave his orders in a voice as flat and precise as a ruled line on a page. The women would be housed in Section C, separated from the male prisoner population. No direct contact with the male prisoners without supervision. All communication through approved translators. Work assignments to be determined after security evaluations were complete. Then Stokes looked at Harlan, held his gaze just a moment longer than necessary. Sergeant, I have read your service file, all of it, including the incident in Bavaria. Harlan felt the ground shift beneath his boots. Stokes knew about the surrendering German soldier, about the beating, about the thing Harlan had done that kept his hands trembling weeks later. I am giving you an opportunity here, Harlan. Stokes said it without threat, without sympathy, simply as fact. Do not waste it. The days found their rhythm. Wake at dawn with a bell. Roll call in the yard, not for military discipline, but to confirm everyone was healthy and accounted for. Then breakfast. And breakfast at Camp Mesquite was something that made Annalise's hands shake every single morning. Not from fear, from disbelief. The smell reached the women's barracks before the bell finished ringing. Bacon. Real American bacon sizzling in cast iron skillets the size of wagon wheels. The fat rendering slowly crackling and popping, sending up thin ribbons of smoke that caught the early morning light and drifted across the yard like ghosts. Eggs fried in that same bacon grease, the edges going crispy and golden, while the yolk stayed soft and trembling. Toast made from thick sliced white bread, browned on a flat grill, and slathered with butter that melted on contact. And coffee. Strong black American coffee that smelled like the earth itself had been roasted and poured into a cup. Annalise sat at the long wooden table in the mess hall and stared at her plate. 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter, a cup of coffee with real cream. According to Army records, each prisoner and support worker at Camp Mesquite received approximately 2,000 calories per day, more than double what German civilians were getting back home. More than double what her mother was surviving on in that basement near Durin, eating grass and tree bark and whatever scraps could be found in the rubble. She ate slowly, carefully, tasting each bite as though it might be her last. The bacon was salty and crisp, and the fat dissolved on her tongue with a richness that made her close her eyes. The eggs were warm and perfect. The toast crunched under her teeth, and the butter was sweet and cool against the heat. She chewed and swallowed and felt the food filling the hollow places inside her body that 5 days of starvation had carved out. And with every bite she thought of her mother. The guilt sat in her stomach alongside the food, heavy and indigestible. She was assigned to the camp infirmary under the supervision of Captain Pemberton, who had also been transferred to Camp Mesquite. The 2 women fell into a working rhythm built on mutual respect and shared competence. Pemberton did not care about nationality or politics or the war. She cared about whether you could dress a wound properly, whether you could recognize the signs of infection, whether you stayed calm when a patient screamed. Annalise could do all of these things and more. 2 years on the Eastern Front had given her skills that no classroom could teach. You are good at this, Pemberton told her one afternoon watching as Annalise bandaged a German prisoner's infected hand with quick, precise movements. They communicated through a patchwork of simple English, basic German, and hand gestures that somehow conveyed everything necessary. Thank you, Annalise replied in careful English. She had been absorbing the language with remarkable speed, collecting words and phrases the way a starving person collects crumbs. The routine was strange but comforting. 3 meals a day, work that gave her purpose. A clean bed, running water, a washroom with soap. These were basic human necessities, things that should have been unremarkable. But after years of war and 5 days chained in a cattle car, they felt like unimaginable luxuries. She began to understand something that troubled her deeply. The enemy was treating her better than her own country ever had. Then Major Stokes called her into his office. The security evaluation. Every new arrival went through it. Stokes sat behind his desk, her file open before him, and asked questions through a translator with the methodical patience of a man dismantling a clock to examine every gear. When he reached a particular page, he stopped, read it again, looked up at her. Miss Brandt, you served at Field Hospital 47 on the Eastern Front. Correct, yes, Annalise answered. Her English was strong enough now to handle simple exchanges without a translator. Field Hospital 47 operated within the zone controlled by the SS Division Das Reich. I was a nurse. I treated all wounded. I did not choose my patients. Stokes leaned forward slightly. Das Reich was responsible for the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, June 10, 1944. 642 French civilians murdered, including 247 women and 205 children. The entire village burned. The room was very quiet. Annalise felt the blood leave her face. I did not know about that, she said. Her voice was steady but thin. I was a nurse at a rear echelon hospital. I treated wounds. I did not participate in operations. Perhaps Stokes replied, but until I can verify that independently, your access will be restricted. No contact with the male prisoner population. No work in the infirmary. You will remain in Section C. He closed the file. The meeting was over. Annalise walked out of Stokes' office into the Texas sun and stood there for a long moment, feeling the heat on her face and the invisible weight of chains that had no iron in them at all. She had been stripped of the only thing that gave her days meaning, her work, her purpose. She was locked away again, not by shackles in a steel bar, but by paperwork and procedure and the cold logic of a man who had lost his son to the same war that had destroyed her family. Harlan found out within the hour. He went to Stokes. Sir, she was chained in that cattle car because she told other Germans to surrender. She is not a war criminal. Stokes looked at him with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. Sergeant, she also treated SS soldiers. That is a fact. Facts do not disappear because she also suffered. He paused, then added more quietly, my son was also just a lieutenant, 22 years old, and now he is in a cemetery in Belgium. I do not beat anyone. I do not break any rules, but I also do not allow myself to forget. Harlan stood there, hearing in those words something he recognized. Grief turned to stone. Pain made into policy. He understood it because he carried his own version of it, the version that had made him beat a surrendering soldier and left his hands trembling ever since. If this story is already making you think about the people in your own life who chose kindness when it would have been easier to turn away, hit that like button now and stay with me. Because what happens next at this camp will test every character in ways none of them are ready for. But understanding a thing did not make it right. Every Saturday, Camp Mesquite held a barbecue. It was a Texas tradition that the American staff maintained with religious devotion, regardless of where they were stationed or what war was being fought. By mid-morning, the smoke was visible from every corner of the camp, rising in thick blue columns from the pit behind the mess hall, where a sergeant from San Antonio named Delgado had been slow-smoking beef brisket since before dawn. The brisket had been rubbed with nothing but salt and black pepper and set over mesquite wood coals 12 hours earlier. The bark, that dark, almost black crust that formed on the outside, cracked when you pressed it, revealing meat so tender it fell apart under its own weight. The fat had rendered completely basting the beef from within, creating a flavor that was smoky and salty and faintly sweet all at once. Alongside the brisket, there was coleslaw, cool and crisp, with a vinegar bite that cut through the richness of the meat, baked beans in a thick tomato sauce that had been simmering since morning, cornbread the color of summer sunlight, dense and crumbly and warm, and bottles of Coca-Cola packed in wash tubs of ice, the glass sweating in the heat, the dark liquid fizzing when the caps were popped. Prisoners were allowed to attend the Saturday barbecue. It was one of the small gestures that made Camp Mesquite different. That made it human. Annalise, though restricted from the infirmary, was permitted to join the communal area on Saturdays. She sat in the shade of a mesquite tree, a plate of brisket balanced on her knees, and experienced something entirely foreign. The meat was unlike anything she had ever tasted. The smokiness, the tenderness. The way the flavors seemed to unfold in layers, each bite different from the last. She ate slowly, reverently, as though performing some kind of ceremony she did not fully understand. Harlan sat down a respectful distance away. For a while, neither spoke. The sounds of the camp filled the silence. Laughter from the soccer field, the clink of Coca-Cola bottles, Delgado arguing with someone about whether mesquite or oak made better smoking wood. Back in Alabama, Harlan said, eventually my father smoked brisket every Sunday. Whole family sat on the porch. That was the one thing he did better than raising cattle. Annalise smiled, small, tentative. The first real smile since arriving in America. In my town near Durham, my father made briselle every morning. The smell of baking dough woke up the entire street. She paused. The bakery is gone now. They sat together in the heat and ate and remembered homes that no longer existed in the forms they remembered. Two people from opposite sides of a war, sharing a meal in the dust of Texas, bound together by the universal language of food and loss. But the fragile peace of those days was about to break. Annalise woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. Low voices in the darkness of the women's barracks. She lay still, eyes open, listening. Sigrid Wendt was speaking, her voice barely above a breath, directed at three other women gathered around her bunk in the far corner. Tomorrow during the shift change, when the guards rotate, we only need 10 minutes. Annalise controlled her breathing, kept her body motionless, listened. Sigrid was not planning an escape. She was planning something more dangerous. She wanted to break into the records office and steal a list. The list of German prisoners classified as cooperators, men who had provided information to American military intelligence in exchange for better treatment or early repatriation. If that list reached the hardline Nazi loyalists among the male prisoners, those cooperators would be targeted, beaten, possibly killed. It had happened at other camps. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a German prisoner named Johannes Kunze had been beaten to death by fellow prisoners for cooperating with Americans. 5 men were hanged for his killing. The violence between factions was real and it was lethal. Annalise lay in the dark and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her chest. She could say nothing. Stay safe. Keep her head down. That was the instinct that had been trained into her for years. Do not make trouble. Do not draw attention. Do not challenge the people around you. It was the same instinct that had allowed an entire nation to look away while millions were murdered. The same silence she had promised herself she would never practice again. She remembered the cattle car, the chains, the darkness. She remembered being punished for speaking the truth, for telling fellow Germans they should surrender. And she knew in a place deeper than words that she could not choose silence again. Not after everything, not after the chains. She would not be the person who looked away. In the morning, she found Harlan. Sigrid Wendt is planning to steal the cooperator list from the records office. If she succeeds, men will die. Harlan's face went hard. You are certain? I heard her. She has 3 others with her. They plan to move during the guard rotation tomorrow. Harlan reported to Stokes. Stokes acted immediately with the swift decisiveness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of threat to validate his caution. Security around the records office was doubled. Sigrid and her 3 accomplices were placed under surveillance. The plan was intercepted before it could be executed. Sigrid was moved to isolation. But before she was led away, she turned and looked directly at Annalise. The other women in the barracks watched. Everyone knew who had spoken. Sigrid held Annalise's gaze and said one sentence in German, her voice flat and cold. Ich weiß, wer eure Stadt zerstört hat. I know who destroyed your town. Annalise felt the words hit her like a physical blow. What did that mean? How could Sigrid know anything about the destruction of her town? And why would she say it to Annalise specifically unless it was a threat or a piece of information designed to wound? Weeks later, Annalise would learn from Captain Pemberton that Sigrid's claim was almost certainly a bluff. As a signals operator, Sigrid had access to communication logs, but the records captured with her contained nothing about specific artillery targets near the Rhineland. She had simply guessed that the mention of a hometown destroyed by Americans would cut deep enough to punish a traitor. She was right about the pain. She was wrong about the knowledge. The fallout was immediate. The German women in the barracks knew Annalise had informed on one of their own. Gertrude Lehmann stood by her vocally and without hesitation, telling anyone who would listen that Sigrid's plan would have gotten people killed and that Annalise had done the right thing. But 6 or 7 others turned cold. Annalise's belongings were disturbed. Her blanket pulled from her bed in the middle of the night. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. She heard the word whispered behind her back. Verraterin, traitor. She had been punished by her own people once for telling the truth, chained in a cattle car and left to die. Now she was being punished again for doing what was right. Different chains, same pain. The loneliness was crushing. She lay awake at night in a barracks full of women who would not speak to her and wondered if this was the price of keeping your promise to never be silent again. If integrity always cost this much. 2 weeks after Sigrid's removal, on a night so dark the stars looked like salt spilled across black cloth, a scream split the air from the guard post near the eastern fence. Annalise heard it from her bunk and was on her feet before she fully understood what she was doing. Instinct. The nurse's instinct that had been hammered into her by 2 years of battlefield medicine. When someone screams in pain, you move toward the sound. Not away, she ran across the yard, found a cluster of soldiers gathered around a figure on the ground. Private Walter Finch, 20 years old, the boy from Dallas who still looked too young for his helmet. He was on his back, his face swelling, his throat closing. His breath came in thin, whistling gasps that sounded like air being forced through a pinched straw. An allergic reaction, severe anaphylaxis, likely triggered by a wasp sting given the welt rising on his neck. Harlan was already there, kneeling beside Finch, his face tight with controlled panic. Finch's lips were turning blue, his eyes were wide and terrified. "Can you help?" Harlan said when he saw Annalise. Not a question about authorization or protocol or whether she was permitted to be outside Section C after dark. Just a question about whether she could save this boy's life. He needs epinephrine, now, and an airway if his throat closes completely. The infirmary is locked. I do not have a key. Then break the door down. Harlan kicked the infirmary door open on the second try. Annalise moved through the supply cabinets with the speed and precision of someone who had done this in far worse conditions. She found the epinephrine, drew it into a syringe, knelt beside Finch and injected it into his thigh. Waited. 5 seconds. 10. Finch was still gasping, the airway narrowing. Not fast enough. She grabbed a scalpel and a length of thin rubber tubing from the surgical kit. Harlan watched as she made a small, precise incision at the base of Finch's throat, found the membrane between the cartilage rings of the trachea, and inserted the tube. A field tracheotomy performed with improvised equipment in the dark by a German prisoner on an American soldier. For 90 seconds, nobody breathed except Finch, and even that was uncertain. Annalise's forehead was slick with sweat. Her hands were steady, completely steady, no tremor, no hesitation. This was the thing she was made for, the thing that no amount of politics or propaganda or national allegiance could corrupt. The simple, irreducible act of saving a life. Finch coughed, then gasped, then breathed. Color flooded back into his face. His eyes found Annalise's face above him, and he stared at her with the bewildered gratitude of a man who had just been pulled back from somewhere very dark. When Captain Pemberton arrived 30 minutes later, she examined Finch, checked the incision site, and looked at Annalise for a long, quiet moment. "You performed a field tracheotomy without a proper surgical kit. I had 2 years on the Eastern Front. We never had proper kits. You saved his life." Then came the sound that nobody expected. Boots on gravel. Major Stokes arriving at the infirmary in the middle of the night, his uniform somehow still perfectly pressed, even at 2 in the morning. He looked at Finch, who was breathing steadily. Now color normal, the tube still in his throat, awaiting proper medical replacement. He looked at the broken infirmary door. He looked at Annalise, who had dried blood on her hands and exhaustion in her eyes. "Who broke this door?" "I did, Sir," Harlan said. And who authorized prisoner Brandt to access the infirmary? Nobody, sir. She heard the scream and came running. She saved Private Finch's life. Stokes stood very still. He looked at Finch again, 20 years old, the same age his own son Daniel had been when he died in the snow at the Ardennes. A boy, just a boy, alive because a German woman had run through the dark and cut open his throat with a scalpel and steady hands. The silence lasted a long time. Miss Brandt Stokes said finally. His voice was rigid, but something underneath it had shifted like a foundation stone that had moved just a fraction of an inch. Your restriction is lifted. You will return to infirmary duty beginning tomorrow morning. He turned to leave, stopped, turned back. And Miss Brandt, thank you. Those two words cost Vernon Stokes more effort than any order he had ever given. They required him to see a German prisoner, not as a category in a file, but as a person who had just saved a life. For a man who had spent months building walls between himself and any possibility of human connection with the enemy, those two words were a crack in the foundation. Small, but real. 1 month later, the camp assembled in the main hall for a screening that would break something inside every person who watched it. The Army's re-education program had been rolling out across all prisoner of war camps using documentary footage shot by Allied cameramen at the liberated concentration camps of Europe. A projector was set up. White sheets hung on the wall. The lights went out. For the next hour, the room watched in absolute silence as the footage played. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, mountains of bodies stacked with the indifference of cordwood, bulldozers pushing corpses into mass graves because there were too many to bury by hand, living skeletons staring into cameras with eyes that had seen the end of everything, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums with bones still inside, piles of shoes, mountains of human hair, gold teeth pulled from the mouths of the dead, over 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Roma-disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, the largest organized mass killing in human history conducted with industrial efficiency by the government these prisoners had served. Gertrude Lehmann fainted and was carried out. Several male prisoners sat with their faces in their hands, shoulders shaking. Sigrid Wendt, brought from isolation to watch, stared at the screen with her mouth open and her certainties crumbling in real time. The 19-year-old girl who had believed so fiercely in the Reich watched the evidence of what that belief had produced, and something behind her eyes went dark and did not come back on. Anneliese watched it all. Tears streamed down her face, but she could not look away. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair until her knuckles went white. She had heard whispers. Everyone had heard whispers. Jewish families in her town vanishing overnight. Deportation trains passing through the station with sealed doors. Rumors about camps in the East where people went in and never came out. But she had told herself it was not her concern. She was a nurse. She helped people. She was not responsible. Silence is complicity. Not acting is a choice. She understood that now, sitting in a dark room in Texas, watching the evidence of what happens when an entire nation decides not to see. When the lights came back on, someone whispered in German. We did not know. The American officer at the front of the room responded through the translator, his voice firm but not angry. Maybe you did not, but many people knew. And now you know too. You can never say you did not know again. The next morning, Harlan found Anneliese sitting alone outside the infirmary, staring at the flat Texas horizon, as though the answers to impossible questions might be hiding somewhere out there in the heat shimmer. You saw the film, he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. The same distance he had maintained since the first day at the rail yard. Close enough to talk, far enough to not presume. How do you? She started struggling with the English words that had become so much easier in recent weeks, but now felt completely inadequate. How do you forgive? After seeing that, Harlan was quiet for a long time. The wind moved dust across the yard in small spirals. I do not forgive what was done, he said finally. I cannot. Nobody can. But you, he looked at her. You did not do it. You did not even know, but I should have known, she insisted. I should have asked questions. I should have looked instead of turning away. Yes, Harlan agreed, and his honesty surprised her. You should have, but you did not, and you cannot change that. What you can do is make sure it never happens again. Make sure you never stay silent again. That is the only way forward. She looked at him. This American sergeant who had shown her more humanity than her own government ever had. Why did you ask me that question? She said suddenly. That first day, when you found me into the cattle car. Why did you ask when I last ate? Harlan smiled, small and shaded and real. Because you looked hungry, he said simply, and because everyone deserves to eat, even prisoners, even enemies. That is what makes us different. Annalise felt tears on her face again. But they were not the same as before, not grief, not guilt, something else, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of healing. But healing was about to be tested in a way that neither of them could have prepared for. Because in the bottom of Thomas Harlan's pack underneath spare socks and a tin of boot polish, Billy Harlan's last letter still waited, and the time for that letter to surface was growing very short. 6 months at Camp Mesquite. November 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered in August. The world was beginning the long, exhausted process of putting itself back together. And at prisoner of war camps across the United States, the machinery of repatriation was grinding into motion. Paperwork, processing, background checks, medical clearances. One by one, the prisoners were being sorted and shipped home to a Germany that most of them would not recognize. Annalise received the notification on a gray Tuesday morning. She was called to the administration building and told through a translator that arrangements had been made. Her mother was still alive, still in that small town near Durin. Transport was being organized. She could go home within the week. She walked out of the building into the pale autumn sunlight and stood in the yard and felt nothing. She should have been happy. She had dreamed of this moment for months, but the word home had lost its shape. Home was a bakery that was now a crater. Home was a father who was now a grave. Home was a brother who might be dead in a Soviet prison camp. Home was a mother who looked 70 at 48. Home was a country that had committed the worst crime in human history and was now lying in rubble trying to pretend it did not know. What was she going home to? And who was she going home as? The Annalise Brandt who had left Germany was a loyal nurse who believed what she was told and did not ask questions. The Annalise Brandt standing in this Texas yard was someone else entirely. Someone who had been chained by her own people and freed by her enemies. Someone who had watched footage of gas chambers and understood that her silence had been part of the machinery. Someone who had saved an American soldier's life with a scalpel and a rubber tube in the dark. She did not know how to bring this new person back to the old place. That evening, she went looking for Harlan. She found him where she always found him. Sitting outside the headquarters building in the cooling air, a cigarette between his fingers, watching the enormous Texas sky turn from blue to orange to deep purple as the sun dropped below the horizon. The light caught the smoke from his cigarette and turned it gold. I am leaving, she told him. Her English was fluent now, accented but clear, the grammar precise in the way of someone who had learned a language through deliberate effort rather than casual absorption. They say I can go home next week. Harlan nodded. That is good. You must be relieved. Yes, she said. Then more honestly, no, I do not know. He gestured to the spot beside him. She sat down. The wooden bench was warm from the day's heat, still holding the sun long after the sun had gone. What is wrong, he asked. She struggled to find the words, not because her English was insufficient, but because the feelings were larger than any language could hold. When I came here, I thought I knew who I was, a German nurse. Loyal to my country, I believed what I was told. I did what I was asked. I did not question. And now you do not know, Harlan finished for her. Everything I believed was wrong. Everything I was taught. Everything I thought I knew about the world. It was all lies, and I did not question any of it. I just accepted it, like everyone else. So do not accept things without questioning them anymore. That is what you learn it here. That is what you take home with you. But how do I live there, she asked. How do I go back to a place that did those things? How do I look people in the eye knowing what happened? Knowing that I was part of it, even if only through my silence. Harlan did not answer immediately. He took a long drag on his cigarette and watched the last sliver of sun disappear. The sky was turning the color of a bruised purple and deep blue and black at the edges. Stars were beginning to appear faint at first, then brighter, crowding the sky the way they only do in places far from city lights. Then he spoke and his voice was different, lower. heavier, like a man about to set down something he had been carrying for a very long time. Annalise, there is something I need to tell you before you go. She looked at him, saw the change in his face, the muscles tightening around his jaw, the way his hands, those hands that had trembled since Bavaria, were gripping his knees so hard the knuckles had gone white. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a letter. Old, creased, folded and unfolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the seams, threatening to tear along the lines. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way you look at something that has the power to both save and destroy. This is the last letter my brother Billy wrote, he said, from the Hurtgen forest, a few days before he was killed. He was 22 years old. He handed it to her, read the last part, he said. Annalise unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was young and unsteady, the pen strokes of a man writing in a foxhole with frozen fingers and not enough light. She scanned down to the final paragraph and read, Tom, today we shelled a small German town. Command said no civilians, military targets only. But after the shelling stopped, I walked through what was left. And there was a bakery, Tom. Just a bakery. Flour still in the air, bread still in the ovens, and the building was gone. Just gone. There were people in the rubble. I did not check. I was afraid to check. I was afraid that if I looked, I would see that they were just ordinary people. Just a baker and his family. And I do not know what that would make me. This war is turning us into something I do not want to be. I keep thinking about Dad's ranch and the smell of mesquite swaying on Sunday mornings, and I wonder if I will ever smell that again. I wonder if the person who comes home will still be the person who left. Annalise read the words once, then again, then a third time. She felt the blood leaving her face the way water drains from a basin, slowly at first, and then all at once. Her hands began to shake. The paper trembled between her fingers. A small town, a bakery, near Düren, in the Rhineland. She looked up at Harlan. His eyes were wet. He was not trying to hide it. I do not know for certain, he said. His voice cracked on the word certain. I will never know for certain. The Army does not keep records of individual artillery strikes on small towns. But the timeline matches. The location matches. Billy's unit was operating in that area during that period. And when you told me about your father's bakery, about the shelling that destroyed it, about Conrad Brandt, who kneaded dough every morning at 4 o'clock. He stopped, swallowed, forced himself to continue. I have been carrying this letter since the day I found you in that cattle car. I recognized the description the moment you told me about your town near Düren. And I did not tell you. For 6 months I did not tell you. Because I was afraid. Because I did not know how. Because I thought if you knew, everything between us would be destroyed. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Annalise had ever experienced. It roared in her ears. It pressed against her chest. It filled the space between them like something solid, something with weight in mass and sharp edges. She stood up. The letter was still in her hand. She looked at Harlan and saw two people at once. The man who had crouched in a cattle car and asked when she last ate, who had cut her chains, who had given her water and soup and hope, and the first evidence she had ever seen that enemies could be human. And the brother of the man who might have killed her father, who might have turned Conrad Brandt's bakery into a crater and left a 60-year-old man buried under the rubble of the life he had built one loaf at a time. She turned away, walked into the darkness, did not look back, did not say a word. There were no words for this, no language in any tongue she knew that could hold the size of what she was feeling. Harlan sat on the bench and watched her disappear into the night and did not follow. He had said the truth. He had kept his promise to never be silent. But the cost of truth was sitting alone on a bench in Texas with the taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that he might have just lost the only person who had made the last 6 months bearable. Annalise did not sleep that night. She lay on her bunk in the dark barracks and stared at the ceiling and felt the walls of her world rearranging themselves into a shape she did not recognize. She thought about her father, his hands always dusted with flour. The way he would lift her up when she was small and leave white handprints on her dark dress, and she would complain and he would laugh, and the whole bakery smelled like warm bread and everything was safe. She would give anything, everything, every meal she had eaten in this camp, and every meal she would ever eat again, to have those flour-covered handprints on her dress one more time. And she thought about Billy Harlan, a boy of 22, riding in a foxhole, afraid, not of dying though he would die soon enough, afraid of what the war was making him, afraid to check the rubble because he knew what he would find. A boy who did not want to destroy a bakery, a boy who just wanted to go home and smell mesquite smoke on his father's ranch. The next morning she did not eat breakfast. Could not. She walked through the camp in a daze, ending up near the eastern fence, where the flat Texas landscape stretched to the horizon without interruption. She stood there staring at nothing, feeling everything. She did not expect to find Vernon Stokes standing in the same spot. He was looking out at the same horizon, his posture as rigid as ever, his uniform as crisp as the morning he had stood at the gate and watched her arrive. But something about his face was different in the early light, softer, or maybe just tired. The face of a man who had been holding himself together so tightly for so long that the effort itself had become exhausting. "You look like someone who just read a very bad letter," he said without turning. She did not know why she told him. Of all the people at Camp Mesquite, Vernon Stokes was the last person she would have chosen as a confessor. But grief does not follow logic. And sometimes the person who understands your pain best is the one whose pain most closely mirrors your own. She told him about Billy's letter, about the bakery, about her father. Stokes listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing in the same wreckage. Then Stokes spoke, and what he said was not what she expected. "My son wrote letters too," he said, "from Belgium. The last one arrived 2 weeks after the telegram telling me he was dead. I read it standing in my office surrounded by 3,000 Germans, and I wanted to burn this entire camp to the ground." He paused. His jaw worked as though chewing on something tough. "In that last letter, Daniel wrote something I have never told anyone. He wrote, 'Dad, today I shot a German soldier. I do not know how old he was. I hope he did not have a son waiting for him to come home.'" He stopped. Stokes looked at Annalise. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" She understood. "War does not have innocent people, Miss Brandt. It only has degrees. My son killed Germans. Harlan's brother may have killed your father. Your father baked bread that fed German soldiers who killed my son. The circle has no endpoint. You can follow it forever and you will always arrive back at the same place. More pain, more reasons for hatred, more justification for revenge. Where does it stop?" she whispered. "It stops where someone chooses to stop it. Where someone decides that the person standing in front of them is a human being and not an enemy. Harlan did that. When he asked you when you last ate," Stokes turned to face her fully. His gray eyes, which had been so cold for so many months, held something new. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a fellow sufferer. "And Stokes said slowly as though each word required a separate act of courage, "I did not do that. For months I have looked at 3,000 people and seen only the nation that killed my boy. I have not beaten anyone. I have not broken any rules. But I have also not seen anyone. And that is its own kind of cruelty." He straightened, pulled his uniform jacket down with a sharp tug, the old Stokes reassembling himself but with a hairline crack now visible in the armor. "Will you forgive him?" Stokes asked. "I do not know. You do not have to forgive the war. You only have to decide whether Harlan is a person or whether he is the war. There is a difference." For 3 days, Annalise avoided Harlan. He did not seek her out. But each morning when she opened the door of her barracks, there was a cup of coffee sitting on the step. Still warm, black, no sugar, brewed in the strong Alabama style that she had come to recognize. She knew it was from him because nobody else in the camp made coffee that way. Dark as earth and bitter as truth. On the first morning, she left the coffee untouched. On the second morning, she picked it up, held it, felt the warmth in her hands, then set it down again. On the third morning, 3 days before her scheduled departure, she picked up the cup and carried it with her. She found him in the usual place, the bench outside headquarters, the flat Texas horizon laid out before him like an empty page. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. His face held the careful blankness of a man who had prepared himself for the worst, but was still hoping for something else. She sat down beside him, placed the cup of coffee on the bench between them. For a long time, neither spoke. The morning sounds of the camp filled the silence. Distant voices, the clatter of the mess hall. Somewhere a bird was singing a song that did not know anything about war or guilt or the weight of letters carried too long. My father's name was Conrad, she said. He woke up at 4 every morning to knead dough. His hands were always covered in flour. When I was a little girl, he would pick me up and leave white handprints on my dress. I used to complain about it. Now I would give everything I have to see those handprints one more time. Harlan listened. His eyes were bright with tears. He was not trying to stop. Your brother, she continued. Billy, in his letter, he was afraid. Not of dying, of becoming something he did not want to be. He did not want to destroy that bakery. He did not want to hurt ordinary people. He was a boy thrown into a war just like me, just like all of us. I am sorry, Harlan said. His voice broke on the word. I do not know what else to say. You do not need to apologize for your brother. You do not need to apologize for the war. But you told me the truth. You did not stay silent. You did not hide behind the excuse that you were not sure. You showed me the letter and let me decide what to do with it. She paused, picked up the cup of coffee, took a sip. Strong, black, bitter. The taste of Alabama mornings on a Texas afternoon. The first day we met, she said, you asked me when I last ate. That question saved me. Not the food, not the medical care, not the clean bed, the question. Because it showed me that a human being could look at an enemy and see a person. You taught me that. She set down the cup. Now I will tell you what I have learned. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Forgiveness means choosing to see the person instead of the war. You taught me that, and I will not forget the lesson, no matter how much the truth hurts. Harlan looked at her. The trembling in his hands, the trembling that had been there since Bavaria, since the moment he had beaten a surrendering soldier and discovered the darkness inside himself, was still present. But something else was there too, in his eyes, in the way he held himself. Relief. Not the relief of being let off the hook, the relief of being seen completely darkness and all, and not being turned away. My father used to say, Harlan said quietly, that you judge a man by how he treats the people who cannot fight back. I think that works the other way too. You judge a person by how they treat the ones who have hurt them. If you enjoy this story and want to hear more like it, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because these are the stories the world should never forget. The week before departure moved with the strange compressed speed of endings. Annalise packed her few belongings. New clothes from the American Army to replace the torn uniform she had arrived in. Letters of recommendation from Captain Pemberton documenting her medical skills and specifically noting the emergency tracheotomy that saved Private Finch's life. Addresses of aid organizations that could help her and her mother. The goodbyes were small but heavy. Gertrude Lehman held her for a long time. The older woman who had arrived at this camp, having lost 4 sons to the war, and found in Annalise something like a daughter, pressed her lips to the younger woman's forehead. You saved my life, Gertrude whispered. Not with medicine. When I wanted to give up and follow my boys into the dark, you were there. Do not forget that you matter. Promise me. I promise. Walter Finch stood at attention and saluted. His neck bore a small scar where the scalpel had made its incision. He would carry that scar for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder that a German woman he had been taught to see as the enemy had run through the dark to save him without hesitation. Thank you, Miss Brand, he said. The words were stiff and military and completely inadequate and absolutely sincere. Vernon Stokes shook her hand. His grip was firm and his palm was warmer than she expected. There was no softness in his face. That was not who Stokes was and never would be. But the gray eyes held something that had not been there 6 months ago. Recognition of her as a person, of his own failure to see people, of the slow, painful, incomplete process of allowing the walls to crack. Miss Brandt, you are the finest nurse I have ever seen in any army. And he paused. The words cost him visible effort. I am sorry for the way the first months were. You deserve better. Major, you lost your son. I understand. No, Stokes said, and his voice was quiet but firm. You do not understand, and you should not have to understand. What you should have had from the first day was the same thing Harlan gave you at that rail yard. Basic human decency. I failed at that, and I will do better. Not for you because you are leaving, but for the ones who come after you. It was the closest thing to an apology Vernon Stokes had ever given. It would remain the closest thing to an apology he would ever give. But it was real, and Annalise accepted that. At the gate, Harlan helped her up into the transport truck. His hand reached down, warm, calloused, strong, the same hand that had offered her a canteen of water in a cattle car in Bavaria 6 months ago. She took it and let him pull her up. They stood there for a moment, two people who had started as enemy and prisoner and become something that no word in either of their languages could adequately describe. Not friends exactly, not lovers, something deeper and stranger. Two people who had seen the worst of what humans could do and chosen, despite everything, to see each other as human. "Miss Brant," he said. "Sergeant Harlan," she replied. Both smiled. Neither said goodbye. Neither promised to write. They knew the truth that all veterans of all wars eventually learn. That life carries people in different directions, and sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that exist perfectly within a moment and do not need to be stretched across time to retain their meaning. The truck pulled away. Annalise looked back through the rear window. Camp Mesquite grew smaller. The barbed wire, the guard towers, the mess hall where she had eaten bacon for the first time. The bench where she had learned that forgiveness was not the absence of pain, but the presence of choice. Harlan stood at the gate, one hand raised, silhouetted against the enormous Texas sky. Then the road turned and he was gone. The journey back to Germany took 8 days. Ship across the Atlantic, train through France, then into Germany itself, and the reality hit like a wall of cold water. The destruction was beyond imagination. Frankfurt, Cologne, Düren, cities that had been the pride of a nation reduced to broken teeth jutting from the earth. People lived in the rubble, cooked over open fires in the shells of buildings, picked through debris for anything useful. Children with hollow faces played in streets that were more crater than pavement. When Annalise reached her hometown, she barely recognized it. The main street was gone. The church was a pile of stone. The spot where her father's bakery had stood was a shallow depression in the earth already beginning to fill with the weeds. The entire town of Düren had been nearly leveled during the fighting around the Hurtgen forest. She stood at the edge of the crater and looked down at the ground where Conrad Brandt had kneaded dough every morning for 30 years and felt the grief settle into her bones like winter. She found her mother in the basement. Matilda Brandt was 48 years old and looked 70. Thin to the point of transparency, her hair completely white, her hands shaking with a permanent tremor that came from months of malnutrition. But she was alive, and when she saw her daughter standing in the doorway of that ruined basement, she said the name like a prayer. Annalise. They held each other in the cold dark and cried until there were no tears left. That night, sitting on a salvaged mattress in the basement, sharing food Annalise had brought from the camp, her mother asked the question, "How were the Americans? Were they cruel?" Annalise could have lied. It would have been easier. It would have fit the narrative that everyone in the town still half believed the remnants of propaganda that clung to the ruins like dust. But she had made a promise to herself, no more silence, no more looking away from truth, no mama. They were kind. They fed us, gave us medical care, treated us like people. Matilda was quiet for a very long time. Then she said softly, as though the words were too heavy to speak at normal volume, "Then we were told lies about that too, along with everything else. The years passed the way years do after catastrophe. Slowly at first, then faster, then all at once." 1947. Annalisa found work at a civilian hospital treating the endless stream of sick and injured and malnourished people that the war had left behind. Conditions were terrible, shortages of everything, medicine, heat, staff, but the skills she had learned on the Eastern Front and at Camp Mesquite carried her through. She was efficient, she was calm, she did not flinch. 1948, a letter from the Red Cross. Gustav Brandt, her younger brother, was alive. He had been held in a Soviet prisoner of war camp for 3 years. Starved, worked nearly to death, but alive. Annalise used every connection she had, including the recommendation letter from Captain Pemberton, to contact aid organizations and push for his repatriation. It took 4 months of letters and forms and desperate patience. But Gustav came home, thin as wire, coughing, his eyes old in a young face. But home. 1949. Annalise married a local school teacher named Klaus Hoffman, a quiet man who had lost a leg at Stalingrad and walked with a cane and never spoke about the war unless asked. They understood each other the way only people who have survived the same disaster can understand each other, without needing to explain. They had two children, a boy and a girl, and Annalise told them stories. Not fairy tales, true stories, about what had happened, about what she had seen, about the lessons she had learned at a cost she was still paying. Never stop questioning, she told them. Never accept cruelty as normal. Never dehumanize anyone, not even your enemies. That is how it all went wrong. That is how ordinary, decent people did monstrous things. They stopped seeing other people as people. They stopped asking questions. They chose silence because silence was easier than truth. Do not make that choice. Ever. She never saw Thomas Harlan again. He returned to Alabama after the war, took over his father's cattle ranch outside Tuscaloosa, married a woman named Ruth who taught third grade at the local elementary school. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He did not talk much about the war. Most men of that generation did not. But every Sunday he smoked brisket on the back porch, and during the long hours of tending the fire, he would sit in silence and remember things he never spoke aloud. In the drawer of his desk beneath bills and receipts and the small debris of a civilian life, he kept 2 things. Billy's letter, now so worn the paper was nearly transparent at the folds, and a photograph, black and white, shot by an army photographer at the rail yard outside Munich on April 17, 1945. 23 women standing in weak sunlight, wrapped in blankets, blinking at the camera, with the disbelief of people who have just been told they are going to live. In the center of the group, a young woman with bandaged wrists and dark blonde hair, and eyes that held both fear and defiance in equal measure. He never showed the photograph to anyone. He never explained why he kept it. Some things do not require explanation. They simply exist like scars marking the places where a life was changed forever. Thomas Harlan died in 1998 at the age of 81, peacefully in his sleep in the same farmhouse where he had grown up. The ranch smelled of mesquite smoke and cut grass and the faint sweetness of cattle feed. A good smell, an Alabama smell, the smell of home. After the funeral, his daughter Margaret began the long process of sorting through her father's belongings. In the desk drawer, she found Billy's letter and the photograph. She also found something she had not known existed, a small leather notebook. Her father's war diary, written in a tight, careful hand that she recognized as a younger version of the handwriting she had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists her entire life. She opened it to the entry dated April 17, 1945. Today we found 23 women locked in a cattle car at a rail yard outside Munich. One was chained to a steel bar. I asked her when she last ate. She cried. I wanted to cry too. I almost did not open that door. I stood there for 10 seconds thinking that whatever was inside would just be more trouble, more paperwork, more problems I did not need. 10 seconds. That is how close I came to walking past. 10 seconds is the distance between the man I wanted to be and the man I almost was. Margaret read that entry 3 times. Then she began making phone calls. It took her 7 months. Military archives, Red Cross records, German reunification databases. The early internet still clumsy, but already connecting people across oceans in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the generation that fought the war. One thread led to another, until finally a name emerged from the records. Annalise Brandt. Married name Hoffman. Last known address, a small town near Düren in the Rhineland, Germany. Margaret wrote a letter, sent it airmail, waited. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. Spring 2005. Margaret Harlan flew to Germany. She carried the photograph, Billy's letter, and her father's diary. She rented a car at the Cologne airport and drove through green countryside until she found the town. It had been rebuilt the way all of Germany had been rebuilt, with a determination that turned rubble into order within a generation. New buildings stood where old ones had fallen. A church with a modern steeple replaced the one that had been a pile of stone. And on the corner where a bakery had once stood, there was a small house with a garden out front and flowers in the window boxes. Margaret knocked on the door. A woman opened it. 85 years old, small and slightly stooped, her white hair pulled back from a face that was lined and weathered, but still held the architecture of the young nurse in the photograph. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and immediately unmistakably alive with intelligence. "Are you Annalise Brandt?" Margaret asked. "I was," the woman said. "A long time ago. My father was Thomas Harlan." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Annalise Hoffman smiled. Not a small smile, not a cautious one. A smile that came from somewhere deep and old and had been waiting 60 years for this exact moment. "The soldier who asked me when I last ate," she said. "Yes, ma'am, that was my father." Annalise opened the door wide. "Come in," she said. "Please, come in." The kitchen smelled of baking. On the counter sat a tray of freshly made bretzel, the twisted bread rolls that Conrad Brandt had baked every morning in his shop on this very spot. Annalise's daughter had learned the recipe from her mother, who had learned it from Conrad, who had learned it from his father before him. The bakery was gone, but the recipe survived, passed down through hands that remembered even when the buildings did not. They sat at the kitchen table, the two women, and between them lay the photograph and the letter and the diary. Annalise touched the photograph, gently tracing the outline of her younger self with a fingertip. "I remember that morning," she said. "I remember the light when the door opened. I remember being afraid, and then not being afraid. Because of him." Margaret opened the diary to the April 17th entry and read her father's words aloud. "Today we found 23 women. I asked her when she last ate. She cried. I wanted to cry too. I almost did not open that door. 10 seconds is the distance between the man I wanted to be and the man I almost was." Annalise listened. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "He told me the truth," she said, "about Billy, about the letter, about the bakery. It was the hardest thing anyone has ever done for me, and the most important, because it taught me that honesty matters more than comfort, and that you can look at someone who is connected to the worst thing that ever happened to you and still choose to see a human being." She looked at Margaret. "Your father asked me one question in a cattle car in 1945. When did you last eat? 3 words. And those 3 words changed my entire life. Not because they gave me food, because they gave me proof that the enemy could be human. That kindness was stronger than a propaganda. That compassion could survive even the worst war the world had ever seen." Annalise reached across the table and took Margaret's hands. "I want you to know something. I forgave your father a long time ago. Not for Billy. Billy was a boy in a war who did what boys in wars are told to do. There is nothing to forgive there, only grief. I forgave your father for carrying that secret for 6 months before telling me, because I understand now why he waited. He was not hiding from the truth. He was trying to find the courage to face it. And when he finally did, he did not make excuses. He did not justify. He handed me the letter and let me decide." She paused. "That is what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear. The willingness to speak truth even when truth might destroy the thing you care about most." A small girl appeared in the kitchen doorway. 5 years old, Annalise's great-granddaughter, dark blonde hair and curious eyes that took in the stranger at the table with the frank, unblinking assessment that only children are capable of. "Oma," the girl said. "Who is this?" Annalise lifted the child onto her lap. "This is Margaret," she said. "Her father was a very brave man who did something kind for Oma a very long time ago. During the war." The child looked at Margaret. "Was he a soldier?" "Yes, sweetheart, he was a soldier. Was he a good soldier?" Annalise looked at Margaret across the table. 2 women, 2 countries, 2 families connected by a war that had ended 60 years ago, and a question asked in a cattle car on a frozen morning in Bavaria. "He was the best kind of soldier," Annalise said. "The kind who knew that the strongest thing a person can do is be kind. Even to an enemy, even when nobody is watching, even when it would be easier to walk away." She held her great-granddaughter close and spoke the words that she had been carrying for 6 decades, the words she had told her children and her grandchildren, and would now tell this child and every child who came after. "I was prepared for cruelty. I had built walls against it. But kindness broke through every defense I had. It forced me to see the truth, that people are people no matter what uniform they wear. And once you see that, truly see it, you can never go back to hating." The war ended. The prisoners went home. The soldiers returned to ranches and classrooms and factories and tried to build lives on top of the rubble in their memories. Time passed. The world moved on. But the lesson remained quiet and stubborn, like a small flame in a vast darkness. In our darkest moments, what we choose to ask each other matters. How we choose to treat each other matters. A simple question, spoken with genuine concern, can do more than any weapon ever built. It can break through walls of propaganda. It can shatter a lifetime of hatred. It can remind a person chained in the cold and waiting for cruelty that humanity still exists. April 17th, 1945. A frozen rail yard outside Munich. An American sergeant crouched in front of a German nurse and asked when she last ate. And in that moment, the distance between enemy and friend collapsed into something much simpler and much more powerful. The recognition that we are all just people, hungry, afraid, hoping that someone somewhere will look at us and see not a flag or a uniform or a nationality, but a human being who deserves to eat. 3 words, 1 question, 2 lives changed forever. When did you last eat?